the it of my title as the sea, of course. In considering the southeast coast, I could make lots of links with other papers today already: beach markets, fishing seasons, maritime cultural landscapes, and so on and so on. Inevitably, as I'm going to be talking about the southeast coast, I'm going to be talking more about boroughs than rural settlements. I just will point up the early nature of settlements on the southeast coast, but I'm going to concentrate on the post-conquest period. And one of the main points I have to make really is that over the last 2 decades, these settlements have been the subject of new published research into their archaeology, their documentary, and their buildings history, and they're listed in a big bibliography, which I've put on my academia page. And everything today I say today is very summary. So these settlements are primarily the cinque or cinque ports, the 2 ancient towns, and the very small fishing ports or hamlets, which were their limbs or members. The head ports and ancient towns, shown in large squares, run from Hastings in Sussex to Rye and Winchelsea on the Kent-Sussex border.
Sorry.
Yes. So the cinque ports ran round as far as Sandwich. Rye and Winchelsea were originally members of the head port of Hastings, and they gained the status of ancient towns by the end of the 12th century as they grew, and then they eclipsed Hastings in economic and maritime importance. So Romney Marsh was the hinterland of the southern ports of Hythe, New Romney, Rye, and Old Winchelsea. And I will come to the distinction between Old and New Winchelsea. Most of these places developed into early towns from fishing settlements and beach trading places of the 8th century onwards. Their hinterlands were remote, marshy, and crisscrossed by watercourses, many of which were subject to tidal change. And for that, I point you to the work of the Romney Marsh Trust, which is all online now, and especially to the work of Mark Gardner. The ancient town of Old Winchelsea doesn't appear on this map because its exact location is unknown. It originated as a beach market with tolls and a farm paid by 1042. It lay on a vulnerable shingle bank, and it was lost to the sea between about 1220 and 1250. You just need to get a general impression here, provided you got the new slide. Okay, these southerly ports subsequently benefited from the physical and development and the increasing exploitation of their marsh and forest hinterlands, and from the economic growth consequent on a rising population there. And this growth is evidenced in the number of churches, settlements, and markets across Romney Marsh by the late 11th century, and also in the valleys of the rivers Rother and Brede, and on the upland to the west of the marsh. And this growth was dependent on early tidal inlets at Hythe, Romney, and Winchelsea / Rye. And all these inlets changed over time due to the action of storms and longshore drift. And I can't do more than give some examples shortly. The limbs and members of the cinque ports spread out along the coast from Hastings to those along the Thames estuary and the North Kent coast, including Grange, Faversham, Margate, and they are a long way from their original head ports. The point of the limbs was to provide extra vessels for the ship service of their head ports. Hastings had several limbs to its west, and at least 2 of them, Hydney and Northeye, survived just as lumps and bumps in the fields. At least they did when I last went to look. Bulverhythe, the Burgesses' Hythe, linked to Hastings and now a deserted settlement with the remnants of a Norman church, was recently discussed by Alex Vincent. Of Hastings' 2 major members, Rye originally supplied 2 galleys to the ship service of Hastings 21 vessels. However, Rye supplied 5 galleys by 1229, at which time Old Winchelsea supplied 10. Another limb of Hastings, which was on the Medway estuary, had a tenurial connection to Hastings from the 11th century and a special role. Grange tenants provided a pilot on the sailing route to London for the Hastings portsmen when they were summoned to Westminster, for example, with the town barge decked out with flags, horns, and trumpeters to play on the Thames in 1260 for the King's entertainment. The sailing route, marked in blue here, had since the late Bronze Age run south of the Isle of Sheppey, the large island to the east of Grange, across the confluence of the Medway and Thames, north up the Yantlet Creek, and then west up the Thames. And this confluence could be very rough on a windy day, but the sailing route was also subject to complex tides and mud flats, which I think Speed represented quite well here, hence the need for a local pilot, which Grange provided. Further east, this sailing route went along the Wantsum Channel via Sandwich and its limbs Stonar, Sarr and Reculver. This avoided a dangerous sail around Thanet until the channel gradually became silted in the 17th century. The Wantsum had also provided an anchorage for Sandwich in which carracks from Genoa and galleys from Florence and Venice were berthed to transship goods for London. Old Winchelsea was replaced by the important royal town of New Winchelsea in about 1290. Its main function was to import, store and sell Gascon wine, and at least 58 striking medieval undercrofts or vaults survive and a possible vintner's hall. The origins of Rye, the other ancient town, were quite different from those of the rest of the ports of the Confederation. Rye was founded as a new borough by its overlord, Fécamp Abbey, between 1066 and 1086, at which time it was assessed as having 64 burgesses. There was a mint at Rye by about 1115. There'd been access from the Channel to Rye from 700 to 800 via a tidal inlet. Unlike the other ports, both New Winchelsea and Rye were situated high on hills above an estuarine harbour area into which the rivers Brede, Tillingham and Rother all flowed. This formed the major anchorage known by 1374 as the Camber, where Henry VIII built Camber Castle after it was all silted up, but where vessels from the southerly ports and their members were often ordered to assemble in the medieval period when their service was required. Vessels from the northern Cinque ports often assembled at Sandwich. By about 1000, Sandwich was an incipient medieval town. It was built on a greenfield site without a predecessor town, not least because of the changing nature of its location, surrounded by the floodplains of the Wantsum Channel and the River Stour. Its early growth depended partly on the continued existence of the Roman roads to the East Kent coast, also on the Wantsum and the Stour, which was navigable as far as Fordwich. Fordwich was another Cinque Port's limb and the outport of Canterbury, so very important. By 1086, urban development is clear in Sandwich's 383 habitable dwellings. Hythe developed rapidly from the late 10th century, replacing nearby Sandton, the earlier non-urban port for trading ships and fishing, due to coastal change. In 1086, Hythe was recorded as having 230 burgesses and thus appears as a flourishing new town. At Dover, there was some settlement within the area of the former Roman fort by the start of the 6th century. By the mid-10th century, a mint there indicates a sizable community. William the Conqueror built on the simple timber and earth defences which already existed, but the stone castle was erected between the 1180s and 1250. Here there was a conjectural hilltop burh or upper town with a church, but the major part of the Norman town was in the valley to the west. Dover had a Burgesses Guild Hall recorded in Domesday Book. Simple timber houses and other buildings dated between 1150 and 1250 belonged to seafaring families, probably including some Dover portsmen who provided ship service. These buildings lay on the eastern flank of the town near the beachfront and about 300 metres from central medieval Dover. The beachfront provided a sizable area for fishing and relating activities, and the earliest buildings may have been seasonally occupied and linked to those activities. From about 1175, there was an intensification of settlement in this part of Dover, occupying land either previously not required for permanent habitation or unavailable due to coastal change. One building on the Dover beachfront may have been a smokehouse for curing fish, of which herring was most important, as at New Romney. Romney originated in the 8th century as a fishing settlement, which in part because of its shelving beach and good anchorage developed into a port, or at least a beach market. Trading vessels were comparatively small, had a shallow draft, and could easily be floated on and off the beach. Subsequently, an anchorage in the estuary was used for larger vessels. Romney is the most likely identification of a port and its associated assets, mills, fisheries, rents, and so on, which appear in a charter datable to between 1023 and 35. Romney's increasing significance is confirmed by the fact it had a mint in the early 11th century. It had 156 burgesses in 1086 and an early guild hall, unlike Dover's, that's not mentioned in Domesday Book. The town and liberty of Romney comprised what became known as Old Romney and New Romney. There may have been a long port stretching down the tidal inlet between them, which was the outlet of the River Rother at this time. By the mid-12th century, the presence of St. Nicholas Church on the southeast margin of New Romney, as well as another urban church, indicates it was new rather than Old Romney, which was then the settlement of growing significance. A leper hospital was established between about 1170 and 80, next to the apparently contemporary harbour wall and near the sea wall, which separated the haven and marsh behind it. New Romney lay on a long shingle ridge, and a very early sinuous beach trackway linked the early town to the fishing quarter at the Strand. But we know that the Guild Hall had gone by 1234 because it was sold to Eastbridge Hospital in Canterbury, and New Romney's early simple street layout was replaced with a new layout, and not, if I may dare to add, on a grid plan, as Beresford suggested. In the second phase of New Romney's development, the beach trackway became known as the Old High Street. A new high street, opening out into a long and cigar-shaped market area, appeared. The new high street seems at first not to have run into Lyd Road, which you can see southwest of St. Lawrence's Church on this map. Lyd Road is a later extension. The framework of New Romney's so-called grid plan was established at this period with 4 long streets, the Old and New High Streets, Fairfield Lane and Rolfs Lane. None of these is straight, and the courses of the Old High Street and Rolfs Lane depend on the edge of the underlying shingle. These long streets are linked by 3 short lanes, and burgage plots surrounded them in the central part of the town. The new layout also included a 3rd church, St. Martin's, which probably opened up a new area of the town, and in time 6 taverns, including the Rome and Jerusalem. During the 13th century, new religious buildings were established, a second hospital, a Franciscan friary, and an alien priory belonging to Pontigny Abbey. Both this and St Martin's Church were associated with Thomas Becket, who sometimes took ship at New Romney and fled to Pontigny. There was also a substantial moated manor on the town outskirts, which had its own chantry chapel. New Romney, like Hythe and Rye, had a sophisticated urban culture which was expressed in its early extensive record making and the literate practices of its inhabitants. The new street layout at New Romney of the early 13th century reflected a thriving town and port. However, huge damage was caused to the shingle ridge on which the town stood by the terrific and well-known storm in the winter of 1287-8. The archaeological record shows damage, especially to the waterfront. Shingle was piled up against St Nicholas Church to a depth of about 3 feet, and the smokehouse on the foreshore destroyed. More significantly for the town was the diversion of the Rother estuary from New Romney to Rye, leading to gradual loss of its harbour. At the town of Hythe, sandbanks also appeared in front of the anchorage after this 1287-8 storm. Hythe's harbour had already been silting up by 1230 and was finally lost during the 15th century. Digging works were ordered there in 1412, but as at New Romney, the loss of the harbour was a slow process, with digging in the haven a marker of final decline during the 14th and 15th centuries. Probably after the storms of 1287-8, Dover was forced to rebuild its harbour. New sandbanks also built up across the entrance to Sandwich's excellent harbour, which nevertheless continued to function, with the town reaching the peak of its trade between 1377 and 1400. By the time Edward reigned as confessor, Dover, Sandwich and Romney provided men and vessels for service at sea when required by the Crown, for which they later received privileges such as significant trade and tax concessions, rights to run their own legal and civic affairs, and subsequently to send MPs to Parliament. The portsmen were known as barons and had much prized ceremonial roles, particularly at coronations. Jointly, the ports extended the monarch's power onto the open sea and the lands beyond. Their influence on regional affairs in times of invasion, war, and internal political conflict was considerable. Having the shortest channel crossings, the ports were required to provide transport for monarchs, their households, and leaders of campaigns, for archers, foot soldiers, and horses. The ports were in the forefront of raids, piracy, and retaliation, whether in times of formal warfare or in between. The Cinque Ports service can be summarised as a total of 57 vessels for a fortnight a year. These vessels for ship service had 20 men and a steersman, and were those normally used for fishing, coastal and cross-channel transport, including that of pilgrims. But of course, other towns along the south coast were also used for providing vessels for these purposes. 25, the ports provided 28 ships for an expedition to Gascony with Richard, Earl of Cornwall, and this can be contrasted with 55 ships provided at the start of the 100 Years' War. The latter was a bigger enterprise, of course, but as you can see, the numbers point up the much greater contribution by the West Country ports in 1337 and the loss of those from the East Coast. In 1337, Hastings, Seaford, Pevensey, Hythe, New Romney and Sandwich provided fewer vessels than in 1225 as a result of silting and storm damage. But there was an increased contribution by the ancient towns, that is 25 by New Winchelsea, 4 by Rye, and 2 more by its future member Small Hythe on the Rother, later the location of royal shipbuilding. This increase depended not only on the establishment of the new town at New Winchelsea, but also on Rye and New Winchelsea's individual port and landing areas and the sheltered anchorage between them, known as the Camber by 1374. And that anchorage was still actively in use in wartime in 1423, when vessels from Southampton, Dorset, Devon and Cornwall of between 20 and 200 tons were ordered to be assembled there. From the later 14th century, all the ports were in danger of raids, and Rye experienced a serious one in 1377, and its response was to build gates and walls to encircle the town. They were developed from a stone wall and a gate, which were among the features of the town listed in a rent roll of 1272. Rye had to be fortified on until the late 16th century, not least because of the Camber anchorage to the southeast. The Camber not only sheltered trading and naval vessels near Rye, but was part of the access by water to the town, so that defences, whether built or artillery, remained important. Rye's significance as a port revived under the Tudor monarchs. It had a large mercantile fleet by tonnage and provided several ships on 5 occasions between 1481 and 1557, mainly for transporting troops. However, the Camber was damaged by the dumping of ballast, the reclamation of marshes, and the consequent failure of the ebb tides to scour the harbour in the mid-15th century, leading to the area of silty black mud you can see on this 1572 map. In 1548, it was claimed that the Camber had once been able to hold 300 or 400 ships, but by then only 30 or 40. It became known, perhaps contemptuously, as the Puddle. In the late 16th century, only small fishing vessels used the strand on the western side. Large vessels remained anchored on the main sea, and they were provisioned by small boats sailing out from the east side of the town. All the Cinque Ports, in a way, had rather similar stories, and their roles were replaced by southerly or southwesterly ports. Well, in sum, what mattered in the Middle Ages, the ports linked the Anglo-Norman kingdom. People debate the significance of their ship service, but certainly the fact mattered that they formed a confederation and they acted together in times of war with France or internal upheaval. They were smallish but lively ports. Their economies were based on fishing, but diversified and provided services for shipping, as well as being local, even regional markets. I haven't been able to talk about all of these, but they're covered in the extensive work now carried out on the Cinque Ports. And all of them, of course, depended on the sea.